Hey all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Katie and today I'm going to be talking through all of the books I read during the month of June. To celebrate Pride, I decided to only read queer writers during the month of June, and I finished 20 books. I think it was probably my best reading month of the year so far because I loved almost everything. So many 5-star reads this month. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you have not already, and now let's get to the books. All right, first up, I have been trying to read through my giant stack of ARCs that I have here in my reading room, so I started the month with Rick by Alex Gino. Alex Gino is most famous for their book George, which is on a lot of banned books list because it's a middle grade novel about a young transgender girl. This book takes place in the same universe with the same group of kids, and we follow Rick, who has discovered that he doesn't really like the way that his best friend from elementary school is treating people. So when he gets to middle school, he has to choose between his longtime friend and a new group of kids that he might like called the Rainbow Spectrum Club. My favorite thing about this book was a scene where one of the kids in the club corrects an adult, a teacher, who says something insensitive about gender neutral pronouns, and the teacher takes the criticism and goes home and works on it, and it was just such a beautiful teachers and students cooperating and teachers listening to kids when they have things to say, and it just made my little teacher heart very happy. This was a great little middle grade read. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I read The Fire Never Goes Out by Noelle Stevenson. Noelle has had a very complex journey with gender for the past several years that they've been very open about on social media, so I was really excited to pick this up. This is a beautiful memoir told with illustrations and with writing, and the illustrations are just gorgeous. I discovered when I took the dust jacket off. Look at that. It's just stunning. Noelle Stevenson is the showrunner for the Netflix show She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, and their debut graphic novel, Nimona, is just one of my all-time favorite YA graphic novels. This was stunning, and I loved, they not only talk about their struggles, but they also talk about how they met their wife, another graphic novelist named Molly Ostertag, who just also writes wonderful stuff. They're the cutest couple ever. Read both of their books. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas, and I am so glad that I finally picked this one up. Shout out to Lucas for insisting every time I saw him, basically, to read this book, because it was everything that I didn't know I needed. So in this book, we follow Yadriel, who is a young trans man living in Los Angeles, and he is a part of a magical community where all of the men in the community are brujos that help spirits who are having trouble finding the afterlife, and all of the women are healers. So Yadriel, as a trans man, is having trouble convincing his family that he is in fact a brujo, and they don't really know what to do with him. This book is so great, and it's the reason that Own Voices books are so great, because Aiden Thomas is a trans Latinx person himself, and there's just so many issues that are tackled in here that are specific to the Latinx trans experience. Not only does Yadriel have to deal with things like being dead named and wearing a binder, but also things that have to do with, for example, the Spanish language, which is a gendered language. There was also an adorable romance in this, and so much beautiful Dia de Muertos sort of vibes, and I loved it so much. 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I listened to Redefining Realness by Janet Mock on Audible. This was another memoir that had been on my list for a very long time. I know Janet Mock primarily from the TV show Pose, for which she's a writer and a director and a producer. And this was just a deeply personal memoir about her experience growing up in a fairly tumultuous family situation, and also discovering her identity as a trans woman and her transition process. This was brutally honest and full of wisdom, but I must say that there's a lot of content that might be disturbing for some people. She talks a lot about domestic violence, sexual abuse, drug use, and also survival sex work. So just be aware as you go into this, but I would highly recommend it. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. The other arc that I read this month was All Out, the no longer secret stories of queer teens throughout the ages. This is a YA short story collection that are all historical fiction, which I thought was interesting, and they all center queer young people. I didn't have a lot of expectations going into this because sometimes these YA short story collections can be sort of like hit or miss, but this was great. There were all sorts of varied time periods and varying identities. My favorite story was a trans Robin Hood retelling that sort of flipped the script on Maid Marian in particular. I friggin' loved it. It was so good. And there were so many just memorable characters in this, and I wasn't expecting that. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. For my classic this month, I read Tales of the City by Armistead Maupin. This was originally published as a newspaper serial in San Francisco in the 70s, and this was a riot. It was just delightful. So this follows Marianne, who is a young woman from Cleveland who visits San Francisco on vacation and decides to stay. She moves into a little apartment owned by this eccentric fabulous woman named Anna Madrigal, who leaves her a joint as a move-in gift. And it just gets more outrageous from there. I gasped multiple times just because everyone has torrid secrets and everybody's sleeping with everybody else. It was a riot, but also was just quietly revolutionary for when it was published in the 70s because it has trans characters and gay characters, and it was just a barrel of fun. Also, gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Also, I must mention that Frances McDormand narrates this in the audiobook. I read 2 poetry collections this month. I'm very proud of myself. And the first one is Black Girl Call Home by Jasmine Mans. This was incredible. I knew it would be. Just look at that cover. This was a very accessible collection. A lot of the poems are just a couple sentences long. So if you're new to poetry, I would highly recommend this for you. It ranged from deeply personal recollections of her mom doing her hair, to her experiences with homophobia as a Black queer woman, to elegies for Sandra Bland and poems about how fierce and strong Serena Williams is. It was just great. I don't know if you can see, but I dog-eared a lot of poems to revisit later, and this is probably one that I will pick up again and again when I need a little poetry in my life. Gave this 5 out of 5 stars. The other poetry collection I read this month was Don't Call Us Dead by Danez Smith. This cover is just stunning. So I read another poetry collection of theirs last month. It was called Homie. Homie was stunning, and it focused on friendships. This one has a much broader focus, and there's a really famous set of poems in here called Summer Somewhere that is about the killing of young Black men by police, which was absolutely incredible, moving, made me cry. It was stunning. This book also deals with Danez Smith coming to terms with their HIV positive status and dating as a queer Black person. And it was just outstanding. I like poetry now, and it is in part thanks to Danez Smith. 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read some more James Baldwin this month. I read his collection Notes on a Native Son. This is divided into 3 sections. The first part is all like literary and film criticism. There's an essay about Uncle Tom's Cabin, and one about Native Son by Richard Wright, and then one about the movie Carmen Jones. Part 2 is America-based political commentary, and it was probably my favorite of the 3 sections. And then part 3 focuses on his experience as a Black American living in Paris. You could read a James Baldwin essay 100 times, and you would have a favorite quote every single time that you read it. He is the GOAT, in my opinion. And every modern essayist that you read and enjoy has James Baldwin to thank for just perfecting the medium. Of course I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. Go read you some James Baldwin. I'm just sitting here like, oh my God, I read so many great books this month, because the next one I finished was Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers. This is unbelievably a debut for how wonderful it was. This follows Grace, who has just graduated with her PhD in astronomy, and she doesn't really know what to do with herself. She's also had some racist experiences while she applies for jobs after finishing college, so it's left her feeling very lost and not sure what to do next. She goes to Las Vegas to unwind, and she ends up married. Classic, love it. So she decides to impulsively move across the country to New York City and spend the summer getting to know her wife. This was beautiful, and not just because of the romance, though the romance is very good, but because Grace's found family, her close friends, her co-workers at the tea shop where she works, just the ride or die friendships in this book are touching and beautiful and everything that friendship should be. And watching her grow in herself, not just in her romantic relationship, really made this book stand out for me. Gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I'd give it more if I could. Next up, I listened to Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford, which is a brand new release. It came out on June 1st. I followed Ashley C. Ford on Twitter for many years, and then John Green released a video recommending this book and talking about how amazing it was, and I was like, yep, sold. John Green tells me to read it. It's probably really good. So this follows Ashley, and this is a memoir about her experience growing up with the specter of her father in her life, because her father was incarcerated when she was very, very young. So this follows her experience growing up without a father, really, but how her father's absence impacted her family and her community. This takes place mostly in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and in Indianapolis, and in Muncie at Ball State, which is why I was really interested in reading it. And it's just so beautifully written. It was stunning in her insights, in her personal growth over the course of the memoir. I just cannot highly recommend it enough. It's going to be on everybody's top nonfiction books of the year. And the audiobook is great because she reads it herself. 5 out of 5 stars, for sure. This month, I also read A Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzi Lee, as well as the companion novella, A Gentleman's Guide to Getting Lucky. This one is another one that's been on my list for years, and I'm so glad I finally picked it up, because this was like if YA historical fiction and Regency romance had a baby, and also make it hilarious. So this follows Monty, who is a hot mess. He is an English young man who is about to go on his grand tour, which was a tradition where rich boys got to romp around Europe and like sow their wild oats or whatever. And then they had to go home and get married and like run the family estate and do rich British things. So Monty is a rake, which means he like drinks too much and gambles and sleeps around to distract himself from the fact that he has a gigantic crush on his best friend, Percy. So Percy, of course, comes on the grand tour with him and everything goes wrong, and there are pirates and bandits and mysterious heirlooms that they steal from Versailles. It was just a wild ride, and the romance was super adorable. I will say that for the first like 100 pages, you might hate Monty. I definitely texted Lucas and was like, what is going on? This main character sucks. But he was just, you know, a little tortured soul, and he got it together. And then this is just a little post happily ever after cute little novella. And if you read this one, then definitely pick this one up. It's worth your time. And it's like a little guy. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars and this one 3.5 out of 5 stars. I am extremely proud of myself because I read 2 queer history books this month, which is rare for me to pick up some heavy nonfiction during the summer. The first one I picked up was A Queer History of the United States by Michael Bronski. I've been really intrigued by this whole series. They have like Indigenous history of the United States and disability history and Black women's history. So I decided to pick this one up. I think this was extremely woke for when it came out in 2010, but by 2021 standards, not so much. It is pretty white, it's pretty cis, and it maybe could be called a gay history of the United States because it's not super trans inclusive. But I did learn a lot, especially about like pre-Civil War era United States. They talked a lot about figures that were almost certainly gay, like Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Side note, Emily Dickinson and Sue Gilbert forever and ever. They are my OTP. If you haven't seen Dickinson, the TV show about her, you totally should. So worth your time. So anyway, I learned a lot, but I'm glad that I picked up a trans history as well. I ended up giving this one 3.5 out of 5 stars. The other history book I picked up this month was by far my favorite of the two, and that was Transgender History by Susan Stryker. I think it helped a lot that Susan Stryker has been an activist in the trans community for about 30 years since she came out as trans. This was excellent. I felt like I knew something about transgender history because I know about Stonewall, but there's so much more to it than that. There's so many more fierce activists than your Christine Jorgensen's and even Marsha P. Johnson, though she is talked about in here a lot. This did a very thorough job of talking about trans activism in every part of society, from the medical establishment and trying to make sure that transgender people were not considered diseased or mentally ill, to political protections and cultural inclusion. There was also a lot in this about feminists that were anti-transgender women, which I thought was super interesting as a feminist myself who does not like TERFs, and just the history of the trans exclusionary movement. I am rambling, but this was really great. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I sort of stumbled across an Audible original short story called Sunset Springs by Kacen Callender. I've read several Kacen Callender books, including King and the Dragonflies, which was one of my favorite middle grade books ever. It was so beautiful. So I was excited to pick up this little short story. So this follows Charlie, who leaves his small town and moves to New York City to transition and come out as a trans man, and then finds himself having to go back to his small town post-transition. And then he ends up in a sweet romance with the quarterback of the football team from when he was in high school, who has recently come out as gay. It was a very sweet little story. It explored the experience of queer and trans people living in small town America and why some choose to leave and some choose to stay and try to help their communities get better, which I thought was a really nice way to add and make this more than just a romance. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read I don't have with me because after I finished it, I immediately lent it to my best friend Kelly because she also loves this author. This was my most anticipated book of the year, and it is One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. This beautiful, beautiful little book follows August, a 23-year-old young woman who has isolated herself out of self-protection. She wants to be independent so she doesn't get hurt. She moves to Brooklyn to finish college, and she finds this apartment full of lovable weirdos. And then on the train, on the Q train, she meets this girl, Jane, who's just this gorgeous, butch, 70s rocker, chic sort of young woman, and they have a connection immediately. After a while, though, she realizes that she only ever sees Jane on the train, and it turns out that that's because Jane is displaced from the 1970s, and it's not just an aesthetic. She is literally from the 1970s. This was magical. I loved the found family. They were so cute. I loved August learning how to be a part of a family and learning how to trust people, and the romance was top-notch, fabulous. I loved that August was bisexual. I loved the bi representation. I loved everything about this book. 17 out of 5 stars. Okay, we're getting close, you guys. The next one I picked up was a reread for me. This is Aristotle and Dante, Discover the Secrets of the Universe by Benjamin Alire Saenz. I decided to reread this one because the sequel is coming out later this year. This is one of my all-time favorite young adult novels of any genre. This is such a beautiful book. Oh my word. Please borrow it from me and read it so we can talk about it. So this follows Ari, who is a bit of a loner. He's kind of a mess because his brother is in prison and no one in his family will ever really talk about his older brother. They just pretend that he doesn't exist. So Ari is at the pool one summer and he meets this other boy that just walks up to him and says, "Hi, I'm Dante. Do you want me to teach you how to swim?" And from there, we explore they just have this beautiful connection, and they learn and they grow together as they finish high school. Oh my God. I can't really explain how wonderful this is. It's really simply written. It's a very sparse writing style, but it's all the more beautiful in the emotions that it captures. This is just the quintessential coming of age novel, in my opinion. And the romance is really sweet and the friendship is beautiful, and I just love everything about it. 5 out of 5 stars, obviously. The last audiobook I read during the month of June was An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. River Solomon is an outstanding Black non-binary science fiction and fantasy writer, which there aren't a lot of those, unfortunately. And I had just heard so many rave reviews about this book that I decided to pick it up this month. This story follows Aster, who is born onto a spaceship called the HSS Matilda. The last dregs of humanity have escaped the Earth onto this ship, and society on the ship functions like the antebellum South. Aster is dark-skinned and is a slave or a sharecropper who helps to produce the food for the Matilda. It's a very oppressive regime. Because of that, there's a lot of brutality and sexual assault depicted. This is not an easy read, but it was unlike anything that I have ever read. It was so imaginative and creative and just took the space opera platform and did so many interesting creative things with it, and also just had some spot on social commentary. Aster is depicted as being on the autism spectrum. They never come out and say that, but it's pretty clear. And they also express a lot of feelings of gender dysphoria and like they feel like a man in a woman's body. So basically in this book, gender is just thrown completely out the window. There's several trans non-binary characters, and it was just such a cool story. Like I said, difficult read, but very important. Gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I didn't really want it to end. I wanted more. Finally, I finished the month off with a YA novel called The Love Curse of Melody Macintyre. I don't have the dust jacket. Sorry about that. This is by Robin Talley. This follows Melody, or Mel, who is a bisexual high school student and loves stage managing and all things behind the scenes in her theater department at her high school. At the beginning of the book, she has a very public breakup with another crew member in the middle of the show, and she therefore decides to not date during the next show because it's Les Mis, which is her dream show to stage manage. So, of course, enter Odile, the talented young woman who is going to be playing Fantine in Les Mis. They have great chemistry, they fall in love, there's lots of drama. It was very high school, but the theater references and this was just like a love letter to the queer kids and the weirdos of high school theater departments all around the country, and made me feel a lot of high school theater nostalgia. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. It was adorable. Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I just read so many incredible books this month that I wanted to share with you. Please let me know in the comments down below if you have read and loved any queer reads lately. And for now, that's all she read.